Hi, my name's Mark and welcome to the channel. Today I'm sitting down to answer a question that I get pretty regularly, and that is, why do I wind my yarn? You may already know the answer to this question, or you might be curious as well. Skeins, hanks, cake, cones, and balls. Try to say all of that quickly. So we're going to talk about all of these terms, all of the different ways yarn comes to you from a producer, and what you need to do to prep that yarn for your next project. So stick around and let's get into it. In front of me, I have a variety of yarn, and you'll see it all looks a bit different. So let's start by talking about the different forms our yarn might come to us in, and then the steps we would take to get that yarn ready for our project, for whatever we're going to do with it. So let's start with something fairly regular you might see, and that is a bullet skein. So this is Skipper, a cotton yarn from Kelborn Woolens, and if I slide the packaging off, you'll see it's in what we call a skein, and it's technically a bullet skein. It's shaped kind of like a bullet, long, sort of a long oval, and when your yarn comes like this, you don't need to do anything extra to prep it for the project. It's ready to be worked with. And you might think all yarn is ready to be worked with, but we'll look at some other forms where you actually need to take another step or two before you can use the yarn. So for any bullet skein, you should be able to find the end of the yarn, and one end will be attached to the outside of the bullet skein. You can see as I pull this, it's just unwrapping from the outside of this skein. That's one way to work with the yarn. A tip, if you're going to do that, is that you can squish your bullet skein, find each end of the long oval, and then when you do that, it looks a little bit more like a ball of yarn. And that might help it tumble a bit more freely as you pull that end. If you're working with this style of yarn, there are a couple things you can do to make sure that your yarn doesn't run away from you, it doesn't get tangled. One is to put it in a basket or some sort of project bag, and then as you pull, the yarn can freely tumble about. Another thing people like to use is a yarn bowl. I have a yarn bowl behind me on the shelf, the wooden yarn bowl up there. People make them pottery style, they make them out of clay, they carve them from wood, they're plastic, 3D printed, lots of different yarn bowls out there on the market. So you might have one, it can be a fun gift to give a knitter or a crocheter, and then you can put a bullet skein or a ball of yarn, which we'll talk about later, in that. And then as you pull, it just keeps it in one place. The other way you can work from a bullet skein is you can find the center pull. Now, depending on the yarn you're using, depending on the fiber content, depending on the quality of how it's wound, you may not want to pull from the center. Some people find that pulling from the center leads them to enormous tangles, or what they call yarn barf. Kind of gross, but a good depiction of what happens to the yarn. So you may not want to pull from the center. Other yarn may become more trustworthy to you, and you like pulling from the center. The benefit of pulling from the center of any cake or bullet skein is that the yarn will stay stationary. So I don't know if I can find the center of this, but if I reach in and dig out, there we go. I got to the center. So for this demonstration, I'm going to wrap back the outside portion that we were pulling, just so it's out of our way. Okay. So now that I found the center of this bullet skein, I did get a little bit of yarn barf, as they say. Sorry if that's terribly gross. The term refers to any time a large quantity of yarn comes out in sort of a tangle when you weren't intending that. So now that the tangle is gone, I could start working with this yarn. And if I did, I'll just wrap it around my hand here. Once the yarn is ready to come from the bullet skein, as I pull, it pulls pretty freely. There's some resistance, and we're about to get, well, I thought we were going to get some more yarn barf, but you can see it pulling on its own. So again, depending on the fiber you're using, some fiber glides more easily, it's more smooth or silky than others. Some fiber is really sticky, it sticks and clings to itself, so you might not want a center pull, it might break or it might get stuck, there might be too much resistance. So again, depending on the yarn you use, your experience with it, if you're working from a bullet skein, you can either pull from the outside of the bullet skein or find the center and do a center pull. Here's another example of a bullet skein. This is from Scapious Glow Up. It's glow in the dark yarn. And this one actually comes with what they call an easy start. It comes with a little sticker attached to the center pull so that you can pull from the center more easily. It still might get tangled, but at least they give you that start so you don't have to go digging for it. But if you prefer, you can still pull from the outside of this kind of skein. Let's look at another form of yarn that is ready to work with, straight from the factory. This is a specialty yarn. This is a paillette from Lang, or Lang, and it's sort of wound into a cake, but because this fiber is a runner, a sequined runner on a very thin sort of strand of fiber, it's actually around a cone. It's around a cardboard piece that helps keep it from tangling too much. So inside, I'm not going to work through this whole thing to show you, but inside is like a cardboard donut, and the yarn is wrapped around that so it's suspended without getting too tangled, and you can see the hole that runs through. So this sort of yarn, I'm not going to take the label off because all the sequins do start to get tangled. When you're working with anything on a cardboard cone, it will pull freely. You don't have to take an extra step. So when you're working with this, you wouldn't pull from the center, you would only go from the outside, and you could either set it down and have it be still as you work with it. It could again be inside your basket or your project bag, or because the cone has a sort of central hole running through the top and bottom, you could place it on a yarn butler or any sort of spindle similar to the way your thread sits on a sewing machine. So whatever works for you to keep your yarn upright, to keep your fiber in some sort of setup so that it's not getting tangled up in your vacuum cleaner, so that your pets or your children aren't getting into it and then maybe making a mess of your project. This next form of yarn put up, the way it's gathered and then sold to you, is also one that you can work with directly from the store, directly from the producer. And this one looks the most like a ball of yarn. It's still not wound up like you would wind a ball of yarn by hand, but it looks the most circular. It's a sphere of yarn, and you'll see that there is a hole running through the center, just like on our cone. So if I take the label out, I should say before I take the label out, this is Zoe from Juniper Moon, a cotton and linen blend yarn. I should say that it doesn't always depend on the fiber content for the style of skein or hank you're receiving. So just because this is cotton and linen, it doesn't have to be in this shape. It could be in a hank, like these are here, twisted. It could also be caked, like this example. It could be something that comes in a bullet skein. Skipper is a cotton yarn. This is primarily a cotton yarn as well. So it just depends on the manufacturer. Sometimes it's related to the dyeing and drying process. Other times it's just, I don't know, whatever they prefer, whatever they've found to be the best experience for keeping their yarn in good shape, keeping its integrity, and then for people to work with it once they've purchased it. So in this situation, I don't know exactly what you call this shape. I would call it sort of a ball of yarn. But again, you have the hole running through the top and bottom. So this could sit on a yarn butler, and then you could pull from the outside, and it's just sitting there stable. Of course, it could go in your project bag or a yarn bowl. It always works that way. And this one you can pull from the outside or the inside. So if I find the outside strand, as I pull, it's just going to tumble from around it, sort of like a hand-wound ball of yarn. In this case, the ball is still going to move around. If you don't love that, you can pull from the center. Finding the center of these can be a little bit more difficult, and you might get more of that yarn barf, the explosion of yarn that you're not looking for. So it just depends on your comfort level. If you've worked with the fiber before and you know, yes, it's smooth, it works pretty well to just pull from the center, and then your cake or ball of yarn isn't moving around, or if you can't find that center and you're not interested in the tangles, you can pull from the outside. I've got one last style of yarn that does not need any extra steps before you work with it, and that is a cake of yarn. This is a skein, or really a cake of Holst garn, and it is already wound into a cake. So if I take this label off, you'll see the yarn sits in a very sturdy fashion. It is round, but along the sides you can see a clear flat top and bottom. And for this, like many of the other styles, we can pull from the outside or the inside. Again, the choice of pulling from the outside or the inside does relate to the fiber content and the strength of the fiber. This fiber is a non-superwash wool. It's fairly thin, it's fairly lightweight, and if I were to pull on it, it breaks apart fairly easily. Now, most all yarns you can pull and they will break. Cotton, acrylic, wool, it doesn't really matter. Some art yarns with really, really strong sort of plastic in them won't break by hand near as easily, but most anything else, either natural or man-made, will break if you pull with enough force. And a lot of people know that. They choose to pull and break their fiber instead of having a pair of scissors in their project bag. So it's not a bad thing, it's just how the fiber is spun and how it reacts to that force. So again, if your fiber is delicate in some way, if it's a single ply, if it's a very loosely plied hand spun, if it's a non-superwash wool that has a lot of delicacy to it, if you pull too hard, it will just snap and break. And you don't want your yarn to break when you don't intend for it to break. You don't want to have extra joins in your project. So for this fiber, you can pull from the center, but I would be a little worried that at the start, as I pull from the center, I might get a little bit too much resistance. And if I hit a tangle, this more delicate fiber might break. Right now, it's okay. But the minute I hit a snag, I don't want my fiber to break. So when I work with this fiber, I'll probably work from the outside of the cake, where usually when a yarn is caked, I do pull from the center because I don't like for it to move around. But we take into account the quality of the fiber, and not high quality or low quality, but how delicate or how firm, how robust the fiber might be. So far, everything we've looked at can be worked with immediately upon bringing it home from the store. We had bullet skeins, we had cones or yarn wound around a disc, we had sort of a ball of yarn, and we also had a cake of yarn. So why do you see me winding most of the yarn I use? Why do you see me sitting down to tell stories as I wind with my Swift and then my winder? That's because most of the yarn that I get comes in hanks. So here we are, we've arrived at the hank. You can still call these skeins. In different parts of the world, the word skein refers to a different put-up of yarn. In the US, at least in my community and the people that I talk with most, a skein can refer to any single portion, any single ball, hank, twist of yarn. So if you say, I need 3 skeins of yarn for my project, you're not necessarily saying I need 3 twisted up skeins like this, you're just saying I need 3 portions. So 3 100-gram portions, 3 50-gram portions, whatever that is. So it's just a way for us to talk about the individual put-ups of the yarn. The word hank is a little bit more specific. So if I take the label, this is a skein, there we go, I said it, a skein of Sweet Georgia Tough Love sock that I'm currently using as the background color in my sea glass cardigan. So if I take the label off, the word hank describes this large loop of yarn that we'll see. So I'm going to carefully sort of unfurl this, and it will untwist on its own, and then I'll make sure to separate it at the right place. We've got one strand of yarn trying to come with. We don't want this to get tangled. Now, once I have it unfurled, you'll see it's just a big circle. of yarn. And typically, yarn is hanked like this. It's wound around something like a swift and then tied off. You can see a couple places where it's tied and secured so that it can dry. First it can be dyed, and then it can dry, and the dye can take evenly throughout the fiber, so it just sits in this loose situation in a solution of dye, in a solution of hot water, whatever it is for the dyeing process. And so if something is hand dyed, if something is kettle dyed, if something is hand painted, it's helpful to have the yarn in this configuration so that the fiber can really spread out as it's in the solution, it can take the dye evenly, and if it's something that's being painted or striped, variegated, then you can target certain areas because the yarn is all pretty evenly distributed. Once that dyeing process takes place, and I should say I know nothing about dyeing yarn, so this is a very elementary explanation just to get us to why the yarn is hanked for our winding purposes today. Once the yarn takes the dye, once it's ready to come out of whatever solution it's in, it typically stays in this form as it dries. And then this could dry outside, hanging up, it could dry inside. I don't know how people dry their yarn, but it's a good setup for that to happen and for it to evenly dry. If it were already wound up into a ball, into a cake, I don't think it would dry. It would be too dense. It would be hard to dye as well, but it definitely wouldn't dry. So once that's dry, once we have the hank ready to go off to the store or ready to be stored, whatever's going to happen to it next, it's then twisted. And I've seen this happen with machines. I've also seen it by hand. So we're essentially twisting up at each end. And I find that when you re-skein something, when you put it back into a hank for whatever reason, it never looks as pretty as it did the first time. So once I have a few twists in it, it's not terribly tight, it's just enough that it starts to twist on its own, but you can see my twist is still pretty loose. And that's another point of keeping things in hanks. We want the fiber to be in a fairly relaxed state. If it's a natural fiber, like cotton, linen, wool, it's a lot like your own hair. I say this to people often when they're asking about different fiber and why it's stored different ways and how blocking works, all of that. Fiber is really similar to your own human hair. So if you have curly hair, if your hair has any curl pattern to it, you'll know that when you get it wet, the curl pattern returns. If you put heat on it, if you straighten, if you blow dry, if you use a curling iron, you can temporarily change sort of the shape, the quality of each strand of hair. If you like to wear your hair in a really tight ponytail or bun, you'll know that that's not always the most comfortable setup for your hair. It might not be that comfortable for you, but also the amount of tension on the hair isn't going to help it exist in its most natural, healthy state. So when you sleep, when you want your hair to have a break, you'll typically put it in a very loose bun, maybe you'll put it in a loose braid, you'll gather it in some way where there's no tension or very little tension on the fiber, on the hair. So it's the same for yarn. Once we have our beautiful yarn dyed or plied, spun, whatever's happening to it, we don't want to put too much tension on it. So instead of taking the yarn and balling it up tightly or winding it tightly into cakes, a lot of people, a lot of companies and producers keep the yarn in hanks that are then twisted up loosely into this sort of helix. And then, I told you this isn't going to look as good as it did before I took it apart, and it doesn't, it's a little scruffy, but you'll see it doesn't have too much tension on it. The fiber is loose, it's still springy, and if I look at something like this, the fiber is not loose or springy. It's very, very dense, packed down into this cake. And for this type of yarn and what people like to make with it, that's fine. You're not making a spongy, oversized blanket or sweater with this type of yarn. You're typically doing color work, you might be doing felted projects, so you want the yarn to have different features, different qualities. For most merino wool, sock yarns, things that people want to wear close to the skin, they want to make socks, hats, sweaters, blankets, things for babies. Typically, we want the fiber to stay in its relaxed state for as long as possible. Another reason that a dyer might leave the yarn hanked instead of winding it up is just another step of production. I think the idea of keeping the fiber in a really healthy state trumps everything else. I would rather buy yarn that has its integrity, where I can see how plump and squishy it is, where I can inspect the ply. I would rather have all of those options as a buyer than to have the yarn already wound for me. And then once I buy yarn, and this is probably true for you if you like to buy yarn and if you have any sort of stash at home, you may not use your yarn immediately. And the idea then is that you'll keep your yarn hanked until you're ready to use it. Sometimes I get too eager and I want to wind up yarn immediately, but I don't want it to sit there for 2 or 3 years wound into cakes. If I do, it's not the end of the world, but it does put more stress on the fiber. It can thin it out a little bit. So if you're not going to use the fiber immediately, it makes sense to keep it in whatever form it comes to you in. One more point about hanks, and then we'll start winding. Another reason that people like to leave yarn in hanks is so that you can really see and inspect the color. This is a skein that was sent to me by Kettle and Hearth, and because it's a variegated colorway, it's got a lot going on. I'll say first, the color is Nutmeg Spice, and this is a fingering weight yarn, 80% Blueface Leicester, 20% nylon. So if I take this yarn apart and I open up the hank, I'll be able to see the nuance of the way it's dyed a little bit more clearly. If this were already wound into a cake, it would be very challenging for me to see exactly how the colors are paced and the total range of them. So sometimes if you're just inspecting color, you might take a hank apart like that, and then you'll just twist it back up. Remember, if you are re-skeining yarn for any reason, when we twist it, we're just twisting it enough so that it comes back together in a twist. We don't want to put so much tension on it, so it's really easy to over twist and have it tightly wound up, but we just want enough so that it twists up on its own. And it'll look a bit scruffy, but the idea is that we still have sort of loose, free and easy put up for that fiber. The last thing I have in front of me, in case you're curious, is a pre-caked skein of yarn. So this is yarn that I caked myself. I was planning to use it for a project, but then the yarn wasn't right for that project. So I used the first skein, some of the first skein, and then realized it wasn't creating the fabric I wanted. So I have some left over that I'd already wound. And as I mentioned, if possible, I don't want my yarn to just sit in cakes forever. I would rather re-skein them. So we're going to work backwards and take this apart, put it back on the Swift, and then get it into a looser setup to live in my stash, live on my yarn wall until I'm ready to use it. Now for our winding. If you find yourself with a hank of yarn that needs to be wound, you'll need a couple of other supplies. You could do this with no supplies, and first let's talk about how to do that. So step one is to open our hank of yarn, making sure not to tangle it. Different yarn producers will tie the yarn off. Sometimes people tie it off once, sometimes twice. This particular skein has 3 places where it's tied off. Some companies will tie off 6 or 7 times, which is a lot. A lot of people will tie off just once or twice. And if that's the case, be really careful as you unfurl the yarn because you don't want to get some of the strands on the wrong side and separate it out incorrectly. If you do, you'll find yourself with major, major tangles as you try to get this into a ball of yarn or a cake of yarn. The next step is to suspend your hank of yarn around something. You could do this over your own arms or hands. If you have a friend, you could have them hold it like this, and then you'll find the starting end of the yarn, which will be tied to one of the places where it's tied off, and then you could start balling it. You could ball it by hand and just have a helper, but it would take a while. Nothing wrong with it, but it'll be time consuming. Another thing you can do is you can put this over the back of 2 chairs. You can spread over the back of one chair, and then with another chair back to back with it, stretch it out so the whole thing is suspended. The important thing is that you don't want this to collapse, fall on the floor, get tangled once you cut it open and start winding. If you have access to a swift, there are different styles of swifts. This is what we call an umbrella style swift. It opens up and has sort of similar mechanical function as an umbrella would have. There are different styles or materials of umbrella swifts. This one is wood from Knitter's Pride or Knit Pro, and it's pretty sturdy. It works pretty well. This is somewhere around $70, so it's not a cheap investment. There are cheaper versions, things made out of aluminum, things maybe made out of plastic that you can find that would do a similar job, but this is the one I invested in. They sell it at my local shop, and I'm happy with it. I think it'll have sort of an eternal life unless I were to, I don't know, put it in the driveway and back over it with my car. So that's that. The little ties occasionally do need to be replaced. At the yarn store where I work, Around the Table Yarns in Shaker Heights, Ohio, we wind so much yarn every day that these need to be replaced a little bit more often. And I think the most sturdy replacement we've used have been shoelaces, waxed shoelaces. So if you find that one of yours breaks off at some point, you could use fiber, you could use yarn, you could use cotton, but if you have something like shoelaces, it might be more sturdy. So for this, we're just going to clamp this onto the edge of a table or a desk, and then I'll show you more details of how we get started. First, we'll take the hank of yarn and we'll fold it over one side of the swift. Then we'll raise the bottom portion of the swift, which will open it like an umbrella, and we want to open it until the yarn is suspended. We don't want to go so far that the yarn is really tight or taut around it, but we come back a little bit. I don't know if you can see the difference. So the yarn is just hanging around with a little bit of freedom. Not so much that it will fall off, but with flexibility. It's going to help us as we wind. The bottom of this swift raises, and then we just crank or turn it to lock that in place. Once the yarn is on the swift will be able to spin freely as we wind the yarn. If you've invested in a swift, but you don't have a winder yet, you can still wind by hand. You can either make a ball of yarn, or you can use a tool to make a center pull cake. It looks like this, and you'll still work from the swift. So if you buy a lot of yarn that's hanked and you don't have access to a local shop to wind for you or a friend with a winder, getting the swift is probably the first place to invest. It's most important that your hank of yarn can stay suspended and then spin freely. The winding part you can do fairly easily by hand. You can also do it really easily with the tool like the center pull cake winder. So our next step is to go around and snip all of the ties. As you snip your ties, be really careful that you're not snipping through the length of yarn in the skein. If you cut through that, you're going to find breaks as you go, and it will mean more joining for you later. And ideally, we don't want more joins than we have to have in any project. So I'll snip here at the bottom of the first tie, and then I'll just pull that first one out. Sometimes producers will tie yarn off with a contrasting color or fiber, which I think is great. It's much easier to know what you're supposed to cut. This one is tied off in the same color, which is a little tricky. Now the one I just snipped is attached to the beginning and end of this skein of yarn. So this is important. We need to remember this place. So now that we found it, it doesn't really matter which direction you go. I'm going to snip one end of it, and then I've got the knot still attached. And we're going to use this knot to help us anchor the strand in our winder. So now I'll start pulling from the end that I found, and it takes us to our third and final tie. Again, you may only have one tie, On your hank of yarn, you could have 5 or 6. It just depends on the producer. So make sure you found all of them before you start winding. The way I check for any more is I just continue to pull the start of the yarn. And I've made it around a couple of times now, so I know that's it. I also always start my winding process by doing this. I pull around a couple of times just to make sure that the yarn is not immediately tangled. Sometimes we might have accidentally pulled the strand through a couple of other strands from the hank, and then as we start winding, that's going to become embedded and start to tangle up the whole hank. So once I've gone around a few times, I've got quite a bit of length, I know it's not tangled, so I'm just going to spin it back to get us ready to wind. Okay, and we're back at the start. So if I were winding by hand, I would simply take the yarn around my hand. I would get away from the swift. You don't want to be right on it. I'm just doing this for the sake of a video. And then I would start winding around my hand. If you've wound balls of yarn by hand before, you'd use whatever technique you like. Once you get the starting bit thick enough, then you can turn and wind a different direction. And the swift is going to keep everything from tangling. If you have a winder, this is where it comes into play. This is my Stanwood winder from Needlecraft, and it's a fairly industrial winder. It can handle a large quantity of yarn. It can take 150 or 200 grams of yarn pretty easily. And it's heavy duty. It's physically heavy and I think made of probably steel. So this, just like our swift, will clamp onto a desk or table. So you just clamp it to the table, and then you've got a guide for your yarn. You've got a second guide here, and then you have the cone. The yarn will be wound around. The yarn will be wound around. You have the cone that the yarn will be wound around, and then you've got the handle that you'll turn one direction or the other, choose one direction, stick with it, and that's going to wind our yarn into a pretty beautiful and functional cake. So let me clamp this to the table, then we'll get started. Just like winding by hand, it's important that you give yourself a little space between the swift and the winder. Mine are probably too close again because I'm doing all of this on camera, so I want you to be able to see what's happening. So I'm going to take the end of my yarn where I've got the knot that I saved, and I'll start by feeding this through the guide. Now I could insert it like threading a needle, but I like to just dip below and feed that through. We want the yarn to feed through in the correct direction so that we don't have extra tension on the yarn. If I wound it through backwards, you can see that gives us an extra layer of tension that we don't need on the yarn. So however you get it through the guide, make sure it's coming forward towards the cone. Then I'll bring the second guide around. I'll do the same thing. I'll just pull this through, making sure that it's pulling through in the appropriate direction with no extra twists. Then we've got a slot here on the top of the cone, and that's where our knot is really going to help us. So I slot that in, and the knot is going to keep it from coming out. If you don't have a knot at the end of your yarn, you could tie one. If you don't want to tie one, you don't have to have it. If I put it in further down, it's still going to hold. If your yarn is really thin or really slick and it's not holding on its own, you could double it up. I just folded the end over and I'll pop it in, and that's all going to anchor it. So either use the knot that's there, tie a knot, fold your yarn over, or just stick it through the slot and it'll be okay. Now that that's set up, I do use my hand to help guide the yarn for the first few cranks, just to make sure that I set the cake up with even tension. I like to wind clockwise, but again, counterclockwise, clockwise, doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. So I'll give my first couple of cranks, and you'll see the arm come around, and we start to get the yarn stacking up on the cone. As I keep going, it stacks up more and more, and it's forming the foundation for our cake. Once we've formed that foundation, we can start winding more rapidly. If you wind at lightning speed, it does put a little more tension on the yarn. If you wind more slowly, it keeps the yarn slightly more bouncy, but putting it into a cake either way is adding tension. So it's going to flatten out a little bit. And then once you work with the yarn, especially once you block the yarn, if you steam it or soak it, that integrity, that sort of plushness will come back. So here we go. We can just start winding. Once we start winding, I take my hand away because everything's working out fine. If you notice a lot of tension coming from the swift, the yarn might be flipped around the wrong way. So I'm going to see if maybe flipping my yarn to the outside helps it flow a little bit more freely. That just depends on how it ends up when you've put it around the swift. Sometimes the first way you put it on will be the right way. Other times you'll notice a little bit too much tension. So now that I have it flipped, it is pulling more freely from that side. As we come to the end of the yarn, I typically do put a hand up just to catch the tail. Sometimes the tail will flail around and then get stuck down in the gears. We don't want that, so I just catch the tail as we finish winding the cake. And there we have it. So I'll pull this cake off, and if you have a label for your yarn that you want to live on the inside to remind you what it is, what the dye lot was, I take my label and I just fold it up a couple of times. I set it on the center of the cake. I set it on the center of the cone, and then as I pull the cake of yarn up, it just envelops that label. And there we have it. You'll see the flat bottom and top, but the whole thing is evenly wound up into a nice sturdy cake that we could then pull from the outside or the center. Next, we're going to wind the skein of kettle and hearth, and for that we're going to use an electric winder. This is something that was sent to me by Kato, and we're just going to see how it works. I've seen it on other people's channels, and it seems like it worked pretty well for them. It was easy to put together, sort of 3 steps to just assemble the pieces, and then you'll see we just turn a switch and it starts to wind. It's powered via a USB-C cord, which is what I used for my phone and my iPad. So I just plugged it into the one that I already have here at the desk, and it clamps to the table just like my other winder I have. As we put this skein onto the swift, I want to give a couple other tips that I didn't mention the first time. As we open it up, we of course keep fingers between sort of the correct sides so nothing gets tangled. And then once we have it unfurled, we give it a little stretch. Some people call it snapping. I don't give it a snap normally. I try not to be aggressive with my yarn, but I do give it a stretch. I pull and I run it through my hands a bit just to get it to sort of open up, depending on how long it's been in a hank. It might be, I don't know, it might be kind of stubborn, it might be stuck to itself. So I just run it through my hands, give it a little bit of a pull, a bit of a stretch. And then we spread it over one side of the swift. I extend my other hand, and then we can raise the swift until the whole thing is suspended evenly. Once that's suspended, I'll lock my swift in place, and we're all set up to wind. The same thing here, finding each tie and snipping. It looks like the first one I found is where our start and finish of the skein is. So again, we know it's the start and end because we see it coming from each side and it's secured with a knot. So I'm going to cut one side of it, leaving the knot attached to the side that will lead us into the winder. And then I'll do what I did before, where I start to pull, see if it's tied off again. Looks like it's not. That one just had one tie, which again is fine, but it means we need to be a little more careful when we unfurl it so that it doesn't get tangled. And it also looks like the yarn is coming pretty freely from the outside edge of this hank. If it were pulling from the inside and twisting on itself, I would take a minute to then twist the whole hank until it's all lined up, sort of in the correct way. Okay, so I'll do my thing where I spin us back and then we'll start winding. So this winder has a couple of guides. We start by coming up through the very bottom guide. And then this spring pulls away, and there's a second guide. Then at the top, a third guide. We pull the spring up through a fourth guide, and then there's a fifth guide. A lot of guidance here. Then we're instructed to wrap this, I think it said counterclockwise, below the gray line twice. And then the yarn comes up and locks in place. So let's see. The next step is to turn it on. It'll go really slowly at one end, and then we can keep turning and it'll go faster and faster. Okay, so there it goes. It's winding on its own. It looks like the tensioner is doing a pretty good job. I'm going to turn up the speed a little bit, although I'm nervous. Let's let it wind for a second and then we'll stop and take a look. I feel like a witch. Okay, let's pause. That looks pretty good so far. So far, so good. So I'm going to turn up the speed a little bit and we'll see what happens. Okay, this still looks really good. I'm surprised with how good the cake looks. Now, this is not nearly as fast of a process as it was for me winding with my Stanwood winder. My Stanwood winder has a pretty large, I don't know, I think the radius of my Stanwood winder, sort of the sweep of how it winds, is a pretty large footprint, and so it winds the fiber pretty rapidly. If you were working with a small hand-cranked winder, I think it would be similar in speed to this one. So far, nothing has gone wrong. There have been no snarls or tangles. If the hank were tangly, then I would have to intercept and help, just like I do when I'm winding by hand. But it's making a nice cake. So I don't need this winder. It's not something that I would use regularly, but for anyone who has trouble winding by hand or anyone that has any sort of limitation, this is a pretty fun gadget. This is nice to do that task for you. And then you could just mind the yarn here, make sure that it's not tangled. It'll do the winding for you. So that's that. Let's let it wind the rest of the skein. I was trying to think what I could do while it's winding. I guess I could knit. I could text. I could be on my phone. My phone is filming right now, so I can't be on my phone. But yeah, if I were winding a lot of yarn and I had this winder to use, it would be kind of nice. I could set it up sort of the way an electric mixer works, a stand mixer, I should say. I could mix by hand. I could use a handheld mixer. But when I use my stand mixer to do things like buttercream, if I'm whipping egg whites, if I'm making whipped cream, it's nice that you can just turn it on and you can leave it to mix for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And while I'm doing that, I can clean the kitchen, I could prep other ingredients, or I could just take a break. So that's how I'm viewing this. I think that's a pretty good comparison. If you have a hand mixer, it works well, it's cheaper. But if you have a stand mixer for certain things where you really need to work the dough or whip something or mix something for an extended period, it is nice that it's hands-free, you can move on to another task, and sometimes you have to stop and scrape the bowl down or adjust, but for the most part, it minds itself. So that's my experience here. It's kind of fun. And again, I do feel like a witch. I feel like Molly Weasley with her knitting going and her pots and pans scrubbing themselves as she's doing all of her housework at once with the help of magic. Okay, it's done. It definitely took longer, but again, this could be a great tool for someone that doesn't have the ability or as easy of an ability to wind by hand. We got a slight explosion on the top and the bottom just because of the amount of yarn. This was a standard 100-gram skein of fingering weight yarn, but for the most part it did really well. I'll grab my tag just like I did before and we'll put that into the center. And when I pull my cakes off of the cone, I typically do tuck in the bottom and the top anyway. That can happen on any winder. And then here's the cake. We'll compare it to the cake from my Stanwood winder. They're different. This one's more round, all in all, but they're both wound up pretty well. So it works. I'd say the biggest drawback is that it was much slower than me winding with my winder by hand. It would still be faster probably than winding a ball of yarn totally by hand. And again, it's something that you could definitely use while you're knitting, while you're crocheting, while you're answering emails. It will just mind itself, which is kind of nice. That's that. Again, we're talking about it because it was sent to me, which is fun. But neither here nor there. If it's something you think you could use and would help you, go for it. If it's something that you don't need, don't go for it. That's that. Now, before I wrap all of this up, the last thing I wanted to show was re-skeining. Re-skeining can be something helpful to do if you decide you're not ready to use your yarn, or your yarn is just going to sit somewhere, sit on the wall, sit in a bin, sit in your stash for a longer period of time. Or maybe you plan to pass the yarn on to someone else. It could be nice to re-skein it so that they can see the colorway, so that it's a happier way for the yarn to live as you pass it on to someone else. A couple of other very important reasons you might want to re-skein your yarn. If you have colors that you're worried might bleed and they are already wound into cakes, or perhaps they came from the company in bullet skeins or cakes, then you might use your Swift to re-skein those so that you can wash them in hank form. Sometimes yarn will recommend pre-washing, pre-rinsing to prevent color bleed, and if you have something you're worried about, really deep blues, reds, blacks, it can be smart to do that. So if your yarn is already wound, you might need to step back in time, reskein it, get it into a hank, and then you can rinse that and let it dry just like it would dry after the dyeing process. Another reason you might want to reskein is if your yarn has an odor that you're not happy with. I just saw somebody on Facebook talking about yarn they got that's on a cone that smells really sheepy, too sheepy for them. So they don't want to work with it with that odor, but it's already on a cone. It's densely packed. You can't wash the cone. So for them, they could use a Swift, reskein the yarn, and then give it a rinse, give it a wash to get some of that odor out. And then it could get wound into cakes, or they could attempt to put it back on the cone. So a couple extra reasons why it might be helpful to know how to reskein things, get them back into hanks in the future. So for whatever reason you might be reskeining, let's walk through how to do it. I have a cake of yarn. Again, this was caked probably over a year ago, so it sat for a long time, but I'd still like to just get it back into a skein, back into a hank, and then have it sit that way. I don't know. I'm going to be happier with that sort of storage. So I've still got the label in the center, which is helpful. I can put it around the yarn later. I was going to say I won't do a center pull because this yarn is pretty fragile. It's a single ply, but I think I'm going to try it. Let's just try it and see if the yarn breaks. And if it breaks, it's my fault, but hopefully it won't. We'll see if we can manage that. So if the yarn is smooth, if you don't anticipate tangles, a center pull is great for re-skeining. If you do think it's going to tear or tangle, you can pull from the outside. You just have to mind the cake a little bit to make sure it's not going to tumble around and get tangled. I've opened my Swift to be approximately the same level, the same width as it would be for winding this same skein up. We don't want it to be too narrow. We don't want it to be too big. We want to sort of match the same width, the same circumference of the initial hank that it was put into. Then I'll take the end of my yarn with quite a long tail. I'll do this up front so you can see. I'm going to take the end of the yarn with quite a long tail, and I'm going to tie it just once around some of these slats of wood. Once that's tied, I'll give myself a little bit of slack to work with. And then at the top of my swift, I have a little handle. So I'll take that and I just need to choose a direction and stick with it, and I'll start to turn. Just like winding a cake, the first few turns are going to help us set up the base of this hank. Once I've got a few turns in, I can speed up, and I'm just going to turn and spin the swift until I've got all the fiber on it. I'm keeping everything sort of at one level. I don't want to go up or down. I'm just going to let it stack up on itself. And then if you can see from the other camera, my cake of yarn is just sitting, and I keep the yarn sort of using my hand as a guide at the appropriate level so it doesn't have any extra tension as it makes its way onto the swift. Okay, I've reached the end of that, so I'll let that hang. I'm going to find my initial end that I left the long tail for, and I'll just untie that knot. And once it's untied, I'll join both ends. This is just like the yarn we saw from the manufacturers. I'll take the two ends and I'll tie them together. And once those two ends are tied together, I'll run the length around the hank to tie it off. This is going to help keep it from getting tangled, and it will be helpful to us later when we choose to re-cake this yarn. And I've got enough length to do one more tie across the way. All right, now that everything's done, I'll grab the yarn at one end, lower my swift, and then I've got my hank here. I'll take that hank just like before and I'll give it a twist. And I don't want to twist too much, but enough that it wants to start to twist up on itself. I let it twist on itself, and then I take the top and tuck it through the other side. And there we have our re-skeined yarn. Because I've got the tag, I'll put it back around the yarn, and this way this can live in a more relaxed, comfortable state until I'm ready to use it. I think we've covered it all. I hope it was helpful for you to see the different styles of sort of yarn storage, the way yarn might be sitting in your local shop, or the way yarn might come to you in the mail. Again, the only type of yarn that we need to wind is yarn that's been hanked and comes to us in this style of skein. We can do that with the aid of a swift and a winder, or we can do it with the help of a friend, the help of a couple dining room chairs, and some patience. So if you have any questions for me, please let me know in the comments below. I'm always really happy to hear from you. I hope you're having a good October or whatever month, whenever you're watching this video. And personally, I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled that fall is here. I'm thrilled that it's sort of the height of knitting season. I knit year-round, but I'm more excited about it in the fall and the winter. So happy knitting, happy crocheting, happy crafting to you, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye.